Well, good morning. Like Pastor Steve, it's really good to have you guys today. Man, sun's starting peeking out a little bit, right? Come on. Someone needs to pray for spring to come, like right now. I'll excuse you from even listening to the first part of the message. Anyway, my name's Chris. I'm one of the pastors here as well. It's my privilege to share with you today. I want to bring you back to a season of my life where I was pretty discouraged about some things, and went to bed that night really discouraged, woke up discouraged, but come to find out that my dad had sent a text to me, and the text simply said this. It said, "Your remaining debt was forgiven." We had owed my parents some money. That's not the reason I was discouraged. But that gesture of grace during such a discouraging season really uplifted my spirits. Just like the title of the message series, it was so sweet to hear that voice of grace that says, "Your remaining debt is forgiven." It did more for me than just help me not have to pay my parents anymore. It really did. It was such a breath of fresh air. It was and I'm sure you guys have had those moments in your life as well when someone says they're praying for you, or you're encouraged in some way, or someone speaks something into your life that they believe in you. The reason that the sound of grace, that the voice of grace sounds so sweet, one of the reasons is because there's so many voices of ungrace in our world as well. There's so many voices of ungrace as well in our world. I want you to think about that for a moment. Maybe for you, you've had a parent or someone that you really looked up to that spoke ungrace into your life. And it still affects you to this day, maybe even in ways that you don't realize. Or maybe there's a hurt that you still have. There's still a wound, and it just reminds you, and it just grates at your self-worth just a little bit too much, and it's shouting at you, "You're not worthy, see? Yeah, you got this in life, nobody else does," and you're just like, "Yeah, maybe I deserve this kind of stuff." Or maybe, I know this can be this way for me at times, maybe you're your own worst enemy. And when you look in the mirror, you don't even like what you see. How could God even like what he sees? I don't even like what I see. Or when you look in the mirror, you're reminded of some past mistake. See, with voices of ungrace, this is what we need to get for today. They seem very real, but thankfully, they're just false voices. They're just false voices. And we're going to look at some stories in Mark 2. I encourage you to go home. It will take you like 5 to 8 minutes to read it. We're going to go through, just kind of skim through all of Mark 2, and you're going to see so many voices of ungrace trying to shout at people. But thankfully, Jesus shows us that these are just false voices in our lives. And as we get started into Mark 2 here, I want you to remember what Pastor Julian so well set up last week. He said, hey, there's going to be several different people in this story. There's going to be Jesus, who is the voice of grace, and just kind of pretend that you're like looking over his shoulder. What do you see? What are you observing? What are you hearing? What are you experiencing? And then you're also going to see a group of people that are receiving grace. And then you're going to hear of a group of people, and we're calling them ungracious church people. And I know it almost seems like an oxymoron, like, wow, like, yeah, it does happen. And so let's go to the first story. There was some that brought their friend who had a physical disability to Jesus. They wanted him to be healed. They wanted him to be healed. That was their desire. So Jesus was speaking, but there was such a big crowd around that they couldn't get to Jesus. But they were so desperate to get to Jesus that during the church service, that Jesus was speaking at. They actually dug a hole in the roof and dropped him. Not dropped him. That was the wrong way. Just drop him on the ground, right? No, they lowered him to Jesus. It would be like, putting it in context, obviously the roof probably wouldn't be this high because they were in a house, but it would be like someone digging a hole during service. How could you? During service. And then they dropped him onto the stage and interrupted the message. Jesus could have been like, bro, I'm like right in the middle of a 3-point message here. This was going to be good. How could you interrupt all this, right? Let's see how Jesus would respond to this interruption. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, you interrupted my service. Get out of here. Point number 2 was just amazing. Son, a gracious term of endearment for someone that would have been labeled as someone that was paralyzed. Son, your sins are forgiven. Now get this part. That was such a cool part, right? But the crazy part is, instead of being amazed at how deep Jesus' grace was, some ungracious church people were thinking in their minds, they didn't say it out loud, but they were accusing Jesus of overstepping his spiritual authority to forgive sin. They're like, you can't do that. Only God can do that. See, they refused to see the authority that God had given him. So Jesus, knowing what they were thinking, he addressed it, and then he said this to the man with the disability. He said, in Mark 2, it says this, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. The audacity of ungracious church people. They were so bold, I don't know if that's the right word. They tried to discount Jesus. Right? They're like, you can't do this. And that's what Ungrace does. It tries to discount Jesus. It tries to discount grace. It tries to discount people. And there's the first voice of Ungrace. It's, you can't do this. You can't do this. Have you ever treated yourself with that kind of ungrace? Like Jesus, you want to do something great with your life. You want to help others. You want to give grace towards others. And then you're like, you know what? Yeah, who am I? I can't do that. I'm not God. I'm not Jesus. I'm not the pastor. How am I supposed to help other people spiritually? How am I supposed to give grace to other people? Or maybe someone has spoken ungrace into your life trying to discount you. You want to do what? You're like one person. Well, how are you going to make a difference? Or they're like, I know what's in your closet, and you're going to try to be the one that gives grace to other people? Guys, we all have a closet, okay? Every single one of us have a closet. The only one that didn't have a closet was Jesus, but he still gives us the freedom to bring grace to other people. That's his whole revolution. That's the revolution Jesus was trying to bring. See, but even Jesus, think about this, it's so weird. Even Jesus had his skeptics, but it didn't stop him from helping and handing out grace. And he can give you the faith to quiet the negative voices. You can't do this. You're nothing. How can you help someone else? He can help you quiet those voices, and he can help you do the same and be that gracious church person that God has called us to be. We're going to look at another voice of ungrace. I'm telling you, if you don't believe me, go home, again, read Mark 2. It's all over the chapter. You're like, wow, voices of ungrace from everywhere. Let's see how Jesus responded. One day, Jesus was having dinner with people. Surely, there's got to be nothing wrong with that, right? They're just eating. They're just having some tacos at the burrito shop. They're just fish tacos on a Tuesday. Who knows, right? Surely there can't be anything wrong. Not with ungracious church people. They find almost anything that can be wrong. It's like they nitpick at things, right? So these people are, they're observing this party, this hangout that's happening, and then they start to notice who's there. Jesus hangs out with this type of scum? These are like the lowliest of the low. Does Jesus know what these people have done? And so instead of just thinking it in their minds this time, they get bold enough to ask some of Jesus' friends, some of his disciples, like, why is Jesus eating with these types of people? What would Jesus think about their thoughts? Let's look at it. In Mark 2, it says this, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have come to call the righteous, or I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. Here's the second voice of ungrace that you just saw spewing out at these people. You're beyond grace. You're beyond grace. And you see, what's one of the reasons that this voice of ungrace is so hard to ignore is because there is some truth spoken in it. The people who questioned who Jesus was hanging out with weren't lying about these people. They were doing wrong things. They were betraying people. They were doing things that they shouldn't have. They were cheating people out of their money. They were living lifestyles that wouldn't honor God, that wouldn't honor other people. But the whole point is, Jesus hung out with them and gave them grace anyway, because that's his revolution. It's grace. Voice of ungrace. You're beyond grace. And we have a choice to make today. Are we going to choose those negative voices? Or are we going to choose the voice that says, you're not beyond grace? Come to the grace party. Because everyone is welcome at the grace party. It doesn't matter what you've done. But let's talk about the voice of ungrace. Have you ever berated yourself or refused to let something in your past go? Do you still struggle with forgiving yourself for something maybe that happened even a couple years ago that Jesus already forgave you for? Have you told yourself that you're not worthy of God's compassion, grace, and mercy? All the while Jesus is saying, come to the grace party. Come to the grace party. You're welcome here. You're welcome here. Yes, you. Have you ever had someone else treat you with this kind of ungrace, which makes it even harder sometimes to crowd it out like, oh man, it's one thing if I think it, but if someone else thinks it, maybe that means something. Has someone discredited you because of your choices? Has someone made you feel like you couldn't get to Jesus because of what you've done? Hey, let's just kind of set the record straight, and we like setting the record straight around here every once in a while. If you're imperfect, awesome. You're a part of a church that's imperfect. That's awesome. It's so awesome. And you need to know that today. We're the church for imperfect people. Do you know why? Because we knew how much grace we needed, and we're happy to re-gift it to you. Happy to re-gift it to you. We all need it. We all do something. We just talked about it. We all have a closet. Jesus made it very, very clear by this story that anyone, this person, they did this, that, surely not. Anyone is welcome to the grace party. And while that causes some like in our spirit, like, really, these types of people? At the same time, it should be give us thankfulness. Do you know why? Because we're all these types of people. We're all one of those people. There's someone that would look at what you have done in your past and think the same thing. That person? So thank God when Jesus has this party where he's showing people that anyone is welcome no matter what they've done. Wow. No matter what, you can receive and accept the grace that he has to offer. We're one of them. We are one of those people. So thank God he does that for us. But which one are you going to choose? Which one are you going to listen to? The voice that tells you you're beyond grace? Or the voice that tells you, hey, no matter what you've done, you're welcome here. I love you anyway. My grace is here. Will you accept it? Let's take a look at two more stories, but they have the same theme, so we're going to kind of lump them together. In Mark 2, it says this. It says, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples, now they're asking Jesus, and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting? Look at us. Look what we're doing. But yours are not. And then in Mark, later, five verses down, in another story, it says this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to them, look. Ooh, the gossip train is real in Ungracious church people. It's real. Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Now, we're going to unpack that, but I want to share what the third voice of Ungrace is first, and it's this. You don't follow my rules. You don't follow my rules. See, Jesus, I already said this, Jesus was in the middle of bringing this revolution called grace. And these ungracious church people were blinded to it by their own rules. Think about that. They were so focused on rules that they didn't know that Jesus, God in human form, was right in front of them. So instead of seeing and receiving his grace, they were handing out ungrace and condemnation. You don't follow our rules. You don't follow our rules. And like we've gone over with every story today, Jesus handled the situation. Now, I want to make something very clear, because sometimes things can accidentally be taken the wrong way. Jesus wasn't saying that someone shouldn't fast or take a rest day or to even follow God's standards. He was just challenging that ungracious church people were adding so many rules to God's standards. And they wanted to place those rules on others. In fact, let's take the rest day for a moment that God asks us to take. That's a grace. He does that for us. It's so that we can rest. It's so we can connect with God, so that we can have some perspective in our lives. He actually has given us this grace, but they were lumping rule on top of rule on top of rule to where even a grace that God had given had now become a burden. Think about that. Wow. Even in God's standards, there's graces. But then we lump on top and we add these rules. Let me give you a couple examples of this. We don't face this. I'm starting with this. We don't face this now. You're going to kind of think this is silly, but this used to be like this in the church. I remember there was a church that I was leading, and I found out that someone really, really, really liked my speaking. You're all shocked by that, right? I'm like, yeah, geez. and they really, really liked my speaking, but then they said this, I just can't get over the fact that he doesn't wear a suit, so I won't be able to come anymore. Some of you are laughing because you're trying to picture me in a suit. I get it. But there was I know it seems so silly today, but there was a day where an unwritten rule with ungracious church people was what you wore. And it ostracized a whole group of people. Let me give you a couple other, and then I'm going to bring up some that I think we're facing today. Here's a couple others that I think we used to face in the church. It used to be about which denomination you were a part of. They're a part of this denomination? Do they even believe in God? I'm not so sure. Because the only denomination that does is the one that I step into every week. Oh, yeah. I know it sounds so, but that was one of them. It was an unwritten rule. There again, not one as much for today, but it used to be drinking. Drinking used to be another one. That was just kind of an unwritten rule. You can't drink, and if you do, Satan! Something about God only liking PG movies and below. Sometimes it was about, again, not as much today, but sometimes it was about what you could or couldn't watch. And the list was long. I think the Smurfs were on that list at one point. Come on! Stop attacking the blue people. Wow. Here's some of the ones that I think we deal with today that have a lot of unwritten rules to them. Because of social media, I think a lot of our unwritten rules are based off of our political beliefs and what we believe about social issues. How can they? And I'm not going to even get into a lot because Pastor Julian has done a great job of talking about that the past couple weeks, but the premise is, how can they believe that? And how can you believe this? And you can't even be a Christ follower if you believe this and that. Now that I've given some examples, have you treated yourself with this kind of ungrace? I really, really want you to ask this question. Please do, please, because it's so easy to do this. Is your walk with God more defined by rules than relationship? Don't hear the heart wrong. God has his standards, but he never wanted your relationship with him to be defined by rules. When you mess up, do you condemn yourself and allow shame to win out? Do you pull away from God or even the church instead of asking him for grace? Because guess what? I've already kind of hinted at this. The heart behind the standards that God does have is to keep you close to him, not to make you feel ashamed. Did you hear that? The standards that God has are to keep you close to him, not to make you feel so ashamed that you can't draw near to him if you mess up in them every once in a while. Or maybe someone has treated you with this kind of ungrace, and you've had people that have kind of poured condemnation on you for breaking some unwritten rule they keep for themselves. Maybe someone has made you feel like you didn't belong because of some of the beliefs you hold about certain social issues. Again, while God has standards, Jesus' revolution was grace, not rule following. His revelation was grace, not rule following. His revolution was grace, not this political belief. His revolution was grace, not our idea of what this social issue should be. Guys, may his grace win out. May his voice of grace win out in our lives. Will we choose to silence the voices of ungrace and trust in Jesus' voice of grace? That's your decision today. In fact, this is so important. We're actually going to stop right in the middle of the message. Well, for those of you being legalistic, it's more like 75% done. Whew, okay. Oh, man. Unwritten rule, PK, you only have a half hour or less, maybe. No, I'm teasing. We're 75% done about. But I want to stop right here in the service because this is so important. And I want you to take a moment to interact with God right now and ask him, God, which voice of ungrace is winning out in my life? I'll remind you of them if you weren't taking notes. You can't do this. You're beyond grace. So those are the first two. And you don't follow my rules. Seriously, take a moment right now, pray to God, ask him to reveal that to you. I really hope that God spoke something to your spirit. And I hope that today you're going to trust his voice instead of that voice of ungrace that can get any of us. So now that I've shared that, I really want you to think about something. If we who know Jesus and know grace, I'm going to say it again, if we who know Jesus and know grace still struggle with accepting grace, then what about the people that don't know him yet? If we, I don't know if you've been a Christ follower for a year or 10 years or since a child, and we all still have times where we struggle with voices of ungrace in our lives and accepting the grace that Jesus has to offer us. And if we who know Jesus and know his grace can still struggle with it, then what about the people that don't know him yet? This is why we're doing this series, at least partially. This is why we have to be the voices of grace. Because if we struggle with it and we know it, we at least get to hear it every once in a while from someone that loves us or from a pastor. No. Don't believe that voice. That's why we have to be the voices of grace to people around us. In his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, the author started asking people, he just started asking lots of people, even strangers, hey, what comes to mind when you think of a Christian? And here's some of the thoughts that they gave. They said, you know what? When I think of a Christian, I think of potentially the political beliefs that they might have as a Christian, or I think about what they're against, or I think about what they might stand for, or I think about the thought process of morality. And some of those things aren't even bad. But he said, not once in anyone that I talked to, and he emphasized, not once did someone describe a Christian that included them being gracious. Guys, let's not be people who are described by the rules and the unwritten rules and forcing people to believe things, but instead, let's be people that are known by the grace that we give. Because when our rules or beliefs become the loudest voice, this is what, even if it's not intentional, when our rules or beliefs become the loudest voice, this is what it can accidentally tell people. You can't come to Jesus unless you believe a certain way or follow a certain rule. And that wasn't Jesus. Anyone was welcome to the grace party. Anyone. They just needed to accept him. They just needed to believe who he was. Who he was. There was a true story of a girl named Piper who came home to tell her dad how excited she was to be able to be, she finally got the chance to pick her sports team. She usually wasn't able to do that, and it was her turn to pick her own sports team. And so her dad asked her, hey, did you pick all the best players? And this was Piper's response. She said, no, I picked the players that usually get picked last because that's usually me. And I wanted them to know what it feels like to be chosen first because that's what Jesus would have done. Piper gets it. She gets it. It's not about judging people because they're not following our rules. It's about showing people what we believe by being gracious with them. You see, when grace is the loudest voice, it shows people that they can come to the grace party. Let's be like Jesus and show people that they're not beyond grace, that it doesn't matter what they've done. They're still welcome to the grace party. Because being a voice of grace, it's one of the things that's going to help us become more like Jesus and less like ungracious church people. As we start to close, was I good? Maybe I was at 80%, right? As we start to close, I want you to do something we might not typically ask you to do in church. I want everybody to get out their phones. Don't feel weird about this. A lightning bolt is not coming. Everybody get out your phones. And I want you to go to your contact list, okay? And if you don't have your phones, just be thinking of someone in your mind. Because you're like, pastor, church, phones in church? I would never. I left mine in the car. I'm sure most of you have your phones, though. So again, even if you don't, think about someone in your mind. Do you know that God cares about every single person on your contact list? Every single one. And one of the things he cares about is, are they getting voices of ungrace in their life or voices of grace? Literally, I want you to take a minute or two. This is how we're going to close today, and then the worship team's going to come back out. I want you to scroll through your list and say, Holy Spirit, Who on this list has had too many voices of ungrace lately? Then I need to be a voice of grace in their life. And maybe it's through a text or a phone call, or heck, you might even want them to invite them to the breakfast service next week, just so that they know that they're welcome to the grace party. So seriously, I want you to take the next minute or two, be very prayerful about this. God can speak to you. He really can. Have him point out. Just this last service, someone said, yeah, God spoke to me about someone on my contact list. So you take a minute or two to look through your contact list, be led by God, and then I want you to start it by praying to God about that person and asking God what he may want you to do this week. And then in about 2 minutes, the worship team's going to come out, okay?
Did you have enough time? Did someone come up in your mind? Just want to encourage you to maybe send them a text message or a phone call or social media contact. I went to watch a movie this past week with my wife, and it was about grace. The Jesus Revolution. Anybody watched the Jesus Revolution? Right? I'm going to be honest. I usually don't like Christian movies. I don't. Because it's like, really, about Moses? I read everything about Moses. So I like to go to a movie that it's something new. And the cool thing about the Jesus Revolution, it's a documentary. It's not like, hey, let's see what Moses did again, even though you know what he did, right? No, it's let's. So I hope I don't spoil it too much. And I'm not going to try to spoil it too much. I just want to encourage you to go. Because it's about the whole hippie movement in the 70s here in America and mostly California, that hippies were not allowed in the church because of ungracious church people. They were too dirty, didn't have any shoes, they were using drugs, until someone, and I love Pastor Chuck Smith from Calvary Chapel. He started the Calvary Chapel movement. But you know, the only thing that Pastor Chuck did, and you can watch it in the movie, he just simply said, okay, you guys are welcome to the party. You guys are welcome to the grace party. Come on in. And as they started coming in, you know what happened? The carpet got dirty. Because they were barefoot. And ungracious church people started leaving the church. Because hippies were being saved. But the carpet was more important than souls. And we have to be careful. Because we may not care so much about the carpet. But we may care about other things that may be just preventing people from joining the grace party. Wouldn't that be a great heart if all of us go to our coworkers, even the ones that are doing horrible things, and say, you are invited to the grace party. I don't agree with everything you're doing and saying, and I don't approve of any of that, but you don't have to say that part. You don't have to say that part. Keep that ungrace. But you can just say, hey, there's hope for you. There's grace available for you. There's love available for you. There's acceptance for you. And there's a line in the movie, Jesus Revolution, that it really touched me. It was like the hippies were people looking for a good thing, that is God, but they were looking in the wrong place. They were looking for a good thing in a wrong place, and all they needed to receive was grace and someone to say, you are welcome to the grace party. Like PK was saying, maybe a coworker needs to hear, a family member needs to hear. I don't know. You are invited to the grace party. God loves you and He invites you into His family. Let's worship.